Vector is fit to shoulder the challenging task of accelerating sustainable mobility and developing innovative solutions to address the biggest challenges faced by the industry. We believe that sustainable mobility isn't just a vision for the future, it requires immediate action. Our mission to provide cutting-edge technologies and services, reducing carbon footprint for cleaner and greener planet. We offer a range of solutions, including EV charging infrastructure, smart mobility platforms, fleet management systems, and more. Our products are designed to be scalable, efficient, and cost-effective, supporting businesses and organizations in sustainable transition and eco-friendly transport. We are committed to make a positive impact to the world. Join us on this journey toward cleaner air and a more sustainable future. Vector, Indonesian-born global contribution.
Hadirin sekalian, selamat datang di sesi Walking the Talk, Siapa negara-negara yang paling juara melakukan aksi melawan perubahan iklim. Untuk memulai sesi ini, kami mengundang Aishnina Azahra untuk memberikan orasi dalam sesi ini.
Asik. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat siang teman-teman semuanya. Saya Aishnina, sangat senang sekali bisa hadir di sini berorasi di panggung Indonesia Net Zero Summit 2024. Kita semua sudah merasakan betapa ekstrim panasnya musim kemarau akhir-akhir ini. Menurut Health Science Report, kenaikan suhu udara dapat memicu gangguan mental dan depresi. Kita Gen Z termasuk kelompok yang rentan terkena dampak krisis iklim dan akan mewarisi iklim yang lebih buruk di masa depan. Pengendalian krisis iklim belum dilakukan dengan serius. Sampai tahun 2023 ada 126 negara yang belum memberikan pembaruan target nationally determined contribution atau NDC. Dari 69 negara yang sudah memperbarui target NDC, hanya ada 5 negara yang menetapkan target yang ketat, yaitu Australia, Norwegia, Uni Emirat Arab, Singapura, dan Thailand. Pemerintah Indonesia Pemerintah Indonesia sudah mengupdate target NDC, namun belum meningkatkan targetnya secara ambisius. Sumber emisi karbon yang perlu dikurangi adalah produksi dan konsumsi plastik. Karena plastik is oil, plastik is other form of fossil fuel. Setiap tahap dalam produksi plastik menambah emisi karbon, dan setiap ton sampah plastik yang dibakar akan menghasilkan emisi setara dengan 0,9 ton CO2. Dari 8 juta ton sampah plastik yang dihasilkan Indonesia setiap tahun, hanya 10% saja sampah plastik yang didaur ulang. Bayangkan, 10% saja. 90% sisanya menumpuk di TPA, dibakar, dibuang ke perairan, sehingga menjadikan kita Indonesia negara keempat penyumbang sampah plastik terbanyak ke laut dunia. Plastik tidak akan terurai dalam alam. Plastik akan memecah menjadi serpihan-serpihan kecil yang disebut mikroplastik. Dan mikroplastik sudah ditemukan dalam paru-paru, di dalam otak, jantung, ASI, bahkan plasenta manusia. Produksi plastik harus dibatasi karena jumlah plastik yang didaur ulang jauh lebih kecil daripada jumlah plastik yang diproduksi. Daur ulang plastik sangat rumit, biayanya sangat tinggi, dan akan mencemari lingkungan. Bahkan negara kaya dengan sistem pengumpulan yang bagus dan canggih seperti Jerman, Jepang, Amerika, Australia, dan negara-negara Eropa enggan mendaur ulang sampahnya sendiri. Mereka justru mengirimkan sampahnya ke negara berkembang untuk didaur ulang, termasuk Indonesia. Daur ulang sampah kertas dan plastik telah mencemari sungai-sungai kita dengan bahan kimia plastik yang dapat memicu kanker, mengganggu sistem hormon kita, dan mengontaminasi rantai makanan dengan jutaan partikel mikroplastik. Bagaimana bisa negara-negara kaya mengirim sampahnya ke Indonesia? Bukannya mereka punya kemampuan yang lebih besar daripada Indonesia untuk mendaur ulang sampah plastik? Ekspor sampah plastik dan kertas sangat merugikan kita secara ekonomi, mengancam kesehatan masyarakat dan keberlanjutan kehidupan. Saya di desa Gresik, rumah saya menjadi tempat pembuangan sampah plastik dari negara maju. Sampah plastik menumpuk di pinggir jalan, di pinggir sungai, di sawah, bahkan di lapangan. Telur ayam di sekitar tempat pembakaran plastik impor mengandung dioksin 70 kali melebihi batas aman konsumsi akibat abu pembakaran sampah plastik impor yang dibuang sembarangan. Udara yang kami hirup sudah tercemar asap pembakaran plastik dan mikroplastik. Akhirnya saya mengirimkan surat kepada negara maju agar berhenti mengekspor sampah ke Indonesia. Salah satu negara menyalahkan pemerintah Indonesia karena mengizinkan impor sampah plastik dan kertas. Pemerintah Indonesia harus bersikap tegas menolak ekspor sampah kertas dan plastik dari negara maju dan membenahi sistem pengumpulan sampah di Indonesia agar bisa mendukung industri daur ulang kertas, daur ulang plastik dalam negeri. Setiap negara harus bertanggung jawab mengolah sampahnya sendiri. Sangat tidak etis membebani negara orang lain untuk mendaur ulang sampahnya. Pemerintah Indonesia harus menyusun roadmap yang jelas untuk menghentikan impor sampah plastik dan kertas. Untuk mengatasi krisis plastik di Indonesia, pemerintah perlu membatasi produksi plastik karena jumlah plastik yang diproduksi jauh melampaui kemampuan pemerintah untuk ditangani dengan aman. Harus ada regulasi nasional yang mendorong pembatasan plastik sekali pakai, pilah sampah dari sumber, dan pengomposan sampah organik di tiap desa demi menurunkan emisi karbon dan metan dari sektor sampah. Krisis iklim butuh aksi nyata dari pemerintah agar target penurunan emisinya 2050 bisa tercapai. Penurunan emisi harus didukung dengan kepemimpinan yang kuat, kolaborasi dengan kepemimpinan stakeholder, dan melibatkan kita, generasi muda. Saya mengajak teman-teman semua untuk mengurangi konsumsi plastik kita. Kita butuh anak muda untuk saling membantu, saling bersatu demi mengatasi krisis iklim ini. Pemerintah, industri, masyarakat harus berkolaborasi bersama-sama demi masa depan Indonesia yang bebas dari pencemaran plastik agar sehat, aman, dan layak dihuni untuk generasi masa depan. Gaya hidup reduce, reuse, refill harus menjadi tren baru di kalangan Gen Z. Demi kesehatan lingkungan masa depan Indonesia dengan memulihkan krisis iklim di bumi kita. Reduce plastic production, cut carbon emission. Terima kasih. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Luar biasa. Mari kita berikan tepuk tangan sekali lagi. Ini akan menjadi salah satu, by the way, siapa namanya? Dina, you're going to be a future leader. Benar. Seharusnya nanti masuk ke DPR biar DPR kita juga lebih bagus nanti kualitasnya. Ibunya ya, bukan? Ibunya bangga sekali. Coba berdiri biar semua orang bisa tahu ibunya seperti apa. Good. Well, this is going to be one of my most favorite sessions. Kita hari ini bicara mengenai bagaimana Indonesia harus mulai berubah secara progresif, mempunyai kebijakan perubahan iklim yang bisa membawa kita kepada net zero target secara aman dan secara efektif. Dan ada 192 negara di dunia, kita mencari 3 negara yang sukses menghadapi tantangan yang sama, tapi bisa melakukan dan mencapai prestasi yang besar untuk melakukan green transition. Dari 3 negara itu yang kita pilih adalah Tiongkok, ya, Denmark, dan Inggris. Ya. Jadi kita akan mendengar presentasi dari pertama Duta Besar Climate Envoy Liu Chenmin yang datang dari jauh dari Beijing untuk berada di tengah kita. Thank you so much. Ya. Kita juga akan mendengar dari Denmark Climate Envoy Bapak Thomas Anker yang juga datang dari jauh dari Copenhagen. Dan kita juga akan mendengar dari Duta Besar Inggris Pak Dominic yang datang dari jauh dari Menteng. Good. So I have great pleasure to invite former Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs Pak Liu Chenmin and now Climate Envoy of China to give his presentation on the stage. Let's give him a big hand.
Thank you. My dear friend, Dr. Dino, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues and friends, especially the young Indonesian friends, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon to you all. Very glad to be back to Jakarta. I'm honored to join Ambassador Jamie and Ambassador Christensen in this panel discussion at the Indonesia Net Zero Summit 2024. As both China and Indonesia are developing countries, we have worked together very closely in a group of G77 and China in supporting global efforts of addressing climate change over the past 3 decades. Now we remain 2 major countries in the global south. This session, I'd like to share with you the following observations. First, how we see the current global climate governance. Adoption of the UNFCCC in 1992 established the concept of sustainable development for humankind and launched the global process of addressing climate change through international cooperation. But such cooperation was not very effective, to be frank, due to hesitation of some of the developed country parties. The 2015 Paris Agreement sets out the goal of reaching global peaking of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible, and decides to achieve a balance between anthropogenic emissions by sources and removals by sinks of greenhouse gases in the second half of this century. This is the origin of a so-called global carbon neutrality. The Glasgow Climate Pact of 2021 urged countries to achieve the net zero emissions around the mid of the century. Over the past few years, 151 countries around the world have committed to various targets of carbon neutrality, covering 92% of the world's GDP, 89% of the world's population, and 88% of world's emissions. All these commitments have demonstrated that the concept of sustainable development has taken root worldwide gradually. Green and low carbon development has become the top trend of the times. During COP28 held last December, the first global stocktake under the Paris Agreement was successfully completed with commitments of all parties to the transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy system. All this have shown that we, the human beings, is moving forward on track to reach goals set by the Paris Agreement. Dear colleagues, however, the grim reality of the frequent occurrence of the extreme weather events and the adverse impacts thereof has repeatedly sounded the alarm for us. Geopolitical conflicts and unilateral measures continue widening the deficit in global climate governance. Efforts by human beings to combat climate change are far from being sufficient. International cooperation needs to be further strengthened. Globally, 3 significant challenges currently face the world. Number 1, a huge funding gap. Number 2, the need to enhance the maturity of low-carbon technologies. And number 3, severe impacts on international cooperation due to unilateralism. Experiences shows that addressing climate change requires all state parties to adhere to the principles and institutional arrangements established by the UNFCCC and its Paris Agreement. All parties must work together to strengthen global climate cooperation within the framework of sustainable development, enhance climate action in accordance with the principles and rules established by the UNFCCC and its Paris Agreement. For instance, the agreement on the new collective quantified goals should be reached within the framework of Article 9 of the Paris Agreement at the forthcoming COP29 in November. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, let me now share with you what China doing and what China thinks about the energy transition. As the largest developing country with a big population, China knows its role in addressing global climate change. Our people are entitled to achieve their industrialization and modernization. We are also unwaveringly committed to following a path of green and low carbon development in our modernization process. China is committed to pushing forward the achievement of its goals of carbon peaking before 2030 and carbon neutrality before 2060. Since President Xi Jinping announced China's dual carbon goals at the 75th session of the UN General Assembly in 2020, China has established a 1+N policy framework, initiating a nationwide action to achieve these goals. China is actively developing a circular economy and is becoming one of the countries with the fastest decline in energy intensity gradually. The intensity in carbon dioxide emissions continues to decrease, with the development of a circular economy contributing more than 25% for the reduction of carbon emissions. In 2023, China's output rate of major resources increased by over 60% compared to that of 2012. And the value of the resource recycling industry exceeded 3.7 trillion RMB yuan, creating jobs for over 35 million people. China also vigorously leverages market mechanisms to regulate carbon emission trading. We have established carbon markets covering the largest greenhouse gases emissions in the world. One is the National Carbon Emission Trading Market, which has been in operation for more than 2 years. The other is the National Market for the Trading of Voluntary Greenhouse Gas Emissions Reduction, which started in January this year. Number 3, China is actively developing renewable energy. Through continuous innovation and persistent efforts, at the end of 2023, the installed capacity of renewable energy in China reached nearly 52%, surpassing fossil fuels energy capacity for the first time. Since the beginning of 2024, renewable energy continued to maintain strong growth momentum, accounting for 92% of the newly installed power capacity in the first quarter of the year. Over the past months, China has formulated a policy of shifting its energy consumption control to carbon emission control, which includes both total emission control and intensity control. This policy shift will lay a good foundation for China to transition from carbon peaking to carbon neutrality process. Dear colleagues and friends, China's energy endowment is characterized by abundant coal with a lack of oil and natural gas, resulting in a high proportion of coal in China's energy consumption, making the energy transition almost a mission impossible. However, after years of efforts, especially in the last decade, the proportion of coal consumption has already dropped to 56%. This represents a historic process in China's energy revolution and has led to the fundamental environmental improvements. Currently, the world has entered into a new era where renewable energy gradually substitutes fossil fuels. Energy transition is the correct pathway for all countries to achieve sustainable development. China's experience in energy transition is of great value to the world. In the process of advancing energy transitions, China's new energy products, such as the new energy vehicles, lithium batteries, and photovoltaic products, have made important contributions to the global energy transition. Statistics show that China produces around 70% of the world's photovoltaic components, wind turbines, and other new energy products. Over the past decade, the average cost per kilowatt hour for global wind and solar power projects has dropped by more than 60% and 80% respectively, a significant portion of which is attributed to China's manufacturing industry. China will continue to work hard to promote the technological innovation and production in the green and the low carbon sector, providing high quality capacity and products for global efforts to address climate change. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, achieving global carbon neutrality is not only for the well-being of the present generations, but also for the living environment of our future generations. At present, countries in Asia are enjoying strong economic growth, but the demands for fossil fuels remains high. Asian countries are at a critical stage of energy transition, facing multiple challenges, including rising energy consumption, price hikes, financial and technological shortage, low share of renewable energy capacities, and unstable supply chains. How to strike a balance between energy security and energy transition is a common challenge faced by Asian countries, especially developing countries. Here, I would like to share 3 brief suggestions. First, upholding multilateralism. Climate change is a global issue that requires concerted cooperation among countries around the world. All countries should adhere to the UNFCCC and its Paris Agreement as a basic legal framework for international cooperation to address climate change. Stick to the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, formulate their NDCs with maximum efforts based on their own national conditions, and make contribution to the process of global climate governance. Second, promoting energy transition in a fair, orderly, and just manner. The outcome document of COP28 set out the goal of transition away from fossil fuels in energy system in a just, orderly, and equitable manner. This is the first time that the global climate governance has for real touched upon the key issue of fossil fuels, marking the beginning of the decarbonization era for humanity. Just, orderly, equitable, and cooperation are key words for global energy transition. In my view, orderly refers to the fact that energy transition is a process that cannot be accomplished overnight. The transition must ensure energy security and should reflect flexibility, scientific validity, and inclusiveness. Just and equitable require consideration of the different national conditions, development stages, capabilities, and resource endowment of each country. Developed country parties should provide support to developing countries to help achieve a just transition. Third, breaking green barriers through technological cooperation. Filling the gaps in global climate governance and rebuilding trust between the global North and the global South requires genuine international cooperation. Breaking down unilateral barriers, opposing technological blockades, and resisting decoupling and supply chain disruptions. Currently, the protectionism and the unilateral measures of some countries pose significant obstacles to the global low-carbon transition. A recent report from McKinsey International states that decoupling from the most widely used clean tech products in the world today would cost global energy transition an additional $6 trillion, which means a 20% increase to the original energy transition bill. The international community should reject unilateralism and zero-sum thinking, contributing to global climate governance through beneficial competition and cooperation. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, climate crisis profoundly affects human existence and development. We must actively respond to climate change and achieve green, low-carbon, and sustainable development. China will continue upholding the concept of a community with a shared future for mankind and firmly advancing its dual carbon objectives. We are also willing to strengthen cooperation and communication with Asian countries through mechanisms such as the South-South Cooperation and Green Belt Road Initiative, with aim to jointly making positive contributions to global climate governance and low-carbon energy transition, and building a clean and a beautiful world for all. I thank you for your attention. I'm sorry for the overseeing the
Thank
time.
you. Thank you very much. Let's give a big hand to Pak Liu Chenmin. Yeah. Thank you very much. And we look forward to the Q&A after this. You may have a seat. And by the way, Pak Liu Chenmin, I remember going to Beijing, I think 2 months ago, and I know in Beijing, electric cars have green plates.
Yes.
And what surprised me compared to my other previous visits was that green plate cars were everywhere in Beijing.
Yes.
right? So
Not in Beijing, everywhere in China.
everywhere in China, yeah. And I think
And that be prioritized.
yes.
Yes.
And it's important for China to really achieve net zero, because now China is the largest emitter in the world. You took that title away from the United States, right, Joe? And I'm sure you don't mind giving that title as the largest emitter to China. You're now second, right? So thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And then this next country is interesting. I remember I went to this country some time ago, and then they told me, hey, but you know, our economy doubled, right? The GDP doubled, but the energy consumption remains the same, right? And how do you do that? But that's why we're inviting this particular country, and it's a country where I think, if I'm not mistaken, 70 to 80% of the population, maybe even more, maybe up to 90%, own bicycles, right? And if you go to this country, bicycles are everywhere. So I have great pleasure to invite climate envoy of Denmark, Thomas Anker. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome, Pak Dino. And thank you very much for inviting me to come to Jakarta. That has been a good reason to visit your beautiful country and to engage with our Indonesian friends. We have a very long-standing, close relationship. We'll celebrate 75 years of diplomatic relations next year. So that's a good reason to come and have a look at how things are going in the climate and energy space in Indonesia. But what I'm going to talk to you about now is, and what Pak Dino sort of was introducing, is more the Danish example as a small developed economy and very remarkable, of course, intervention by Jianmin Liu, the Chinese envoy, about China's experience. But we are sort of at the other end of the spectrum in a way from China in one way as a small developed economy, but at the same time we share with China and Indonesia the aspiration of the road we have to travel to net zero and to the full decarbonization of our economy. But we come at it from a bit a different starting point than you, because we already peaked our emissions back in the 1990s, actually in 1997. And because of that, we are able to set absolute reduction targets for our economy that we can benchmark up against, that we can measure. And when you can measure progress, that also makes it easier for the general public, for think tanks, scientists, and everyone else to be engaged and actually follow how you're doing. And it's also easier to communicate to your private sector and your investors what you intend to do, what your plan is, what your trajectory is. And what I'm going to walk you through is a bit how we have been doing that in Denmark. If I can have my first slide. So in 2020, 5 years after the adoption of the Paris Agreement and based on a new government that we had in 2019, we put into law our emission reduction target for 2030 of 70%. And that's a 70% reduction on a 1990 baseline. That is the common baseline used by the European Union. We don't submit our own NDC to the UN. We submit a joint NDC as the European Union, but each EU member state have to submit their contribution to the EU, and this is our contribution. So in the law, we reduce our emissions by 70%. We have a long-term climate neutrality target that is based on the 1.5 degree target of the Paris Agreement, and we also then have the sub-target of a reduction of 50 to 54% in 2025. That is next year. It also says in the law that we must be a leading nation in international climate cooperation and that we have a moral responsibility to lead. And in a way, the last two bullets here, that's the marching orders, that's the definition of my job. as the Danish climate envoy, is to work with partners around the world and find out how we can translate what we do in Denmark into learnings and cooperation that we can then transfer to other countries in the spirit of the Paris Agreement, where developed countries are asked to transfer knowledge, transfer technology to developing countries. But what is also interesting in our experience is that in the law we have put in this annual cycle of policy making. You know that in the Paris Agreement, the cycle of the NDC is a 5-year cycle, and all governments have now agreed in the global stocktake to submit a new NDC by February next year. And I know that my Indonesian colleagues are diligently working on preparing the next NDC for Indonesia, and at the EU level we are also discussing what our next NDC will look like. But in Denmark we thought that having to review our targets every 5 years is not enough. In order to be sure that you are on track to meet your targets, you actually need to review them every year. And so in our law, we have built in this wheel of policymaking where if we start in the lower right corner, in every year in September, as a government, we have to present in Parliament a climate plan, a climate program for the next year, where we, in that climate program, have to tell the general public all the steps we will do to reduce emissions and to meet our targets in the next annual cycle. So in a few weeks, we will be introducing the program for what we will do in 2025. That program is then discussed together with the national budget in Parliament during the fall, and then in December we have a debate in Parliament where they discuss the budget and the program, and they pass the budget law, which takes into account the policies and the actions that we need to take as a government in the next fiscal year. In February, every year, we have an independent National Climate Council of economists and scientists that come with their assessment of the climate program. And I can tell you, every year until now, it's been a scathing criticism. They rip the program apart. They tell the minister that he's incapable of doing anything right. They tell us, the civil servants, that we are lazy, that we're not doing enough. Even my mother criticizes me over dinner when she reads this and says, "What are you doing? You're not doing anything. The scientists are telling you that you are incapable." And it's actually pretty tough for all of us who work in the Ministry for Climate and Energy when this report comes out. In April, we then have to, through our energy agency, to report to Parliament on the status of the implementation of the climate program from the previous year. And then in September, we go back in Parliament with the new program for the next year based on the scathing criticism of the independent council on the report of the impact of the action from the last year, and then we do next year's program. This cycle runs every year until 2030, and it's a way to make sure that we are kept on track. If I can have the next slide. So the trajectory that we are on basically has a focus on the 70% greenhouse gas reduction in 2030. That's in the law. Under that is the target of being 100% with green electricity in our electricity system. We are currently at 70 to 80% on an average. Some days it's less if there's less wind. Other days it's 100%. And you will find many energy system operators in countries that have a lot of coal in their energy system who will tell you that this cannot be done. They think that even if you reach 10% of variable renewable energies in your system, the system will break down. That is simply not true. It is absolutely possible to operate an energy system with 100% energy security and 100% variable energy in the system. It's all a question about how you manage the system, if you have a grid that is efficient, if you have a digital support system, the software to operate it. In 2030, our target is to be 55% in total energy consumption, but we will overshoot that target because also in Denmark, the electrification of transport, electric vehicles is taking off, and more than half the cars sold now are either electric or hybrid, and we are by far overshooting that target because we thought it would take much longer to get that electrification underway. We have to be climate neutral in 2045. We have moved that forward from 2050. And it is the aim of the government for us to be -10 negative in 2050. And we are trying to convince our partners in the European Union that we as an EU should be going negative as well. Because in order to stay on track for 1.5 degrees, we believe that there are some large emitters that actually need to be negative, because otherwise we as a planet will overshoot the 1.5. Currently we are on a trajectory to somewhere between 2.5 and 3. Hopefully by the time of the next NDCs next year, the global trajectory will come more towards 1.5, but we probably will have to develop technologies that will allow us to be negative as we go more towards 2050. Next slide, please. Can you advance the slide? There's something missing here. Yeah. This is just to show you in terms of planning that in our annual process, what this means, KF21, that's Climate Program 21, 22, 23, 24. Every year we advance the reduction impact of what's in the program in order to arrive at where we need to be in 2024, which is the 55% reduction in 2025. I know this is a bit confusing, but this is more to show you the planning tools that we apply. And as part of this overall planning, the implementation in Parliament has been now to conclude more than 75 different political agreements and regulatory agreements on everything from energy to power to X to carbon capture and storage, waste, buildings, I mean all sectors of the economy. And the last agreement that we achieved in May this year was to start reducing emissions from agriculture and forestry, and we are the first country in the world now to introduce a CO2 tax on livestock, cows, pigs, other animals. As you know, they have large emissions, and we need to put a price on those emissions in order to bring them down, and we have started to collect methane from livestock and use that as a biogas. Actually, you can put a value on that and use it in industry. And we are attempting to replace natural gas, for example, in cement factories with biogas from agriculture. Next slide, please. Now, this is just an illustration going a bit back of the kind of agreements that we have concluded, waste, transport, agriculture, to show you that it takes very detailed planning, but also implementation in Parliament and through the legislative process to put in place the frameworks that will then manage the economy. And basically, we don't implement ourselves as a government, but we put in place the frameworks for society and the private sector then to operate in a way that means that we will achieve our targets. That also means partnering with Danish business and Danish science community for them to be ahead of the curve. And if I can have the next slide. This is just to illustrate that in addition to what we do as a government, we have teamed up with the private sector who self-organized into the 14 most important sectors for the green transition, and that's everything from manufacturing, IT, to waste, aviation, shipping, construction, commerce, defense, energy. And each sector basically made their own plan for how to achieve the 70% reduction, what they can contribute under our current policies, what extra regulation they need, or what they need us to do at a European or a global level. Danish business don't think that this is a punishment. They think that this gives them a competitive advantage in the global arena because they will be the most efficient companies with the highest level of technology, whatever sector they're in, whether it's Maersk as a shipping company, Lego in plastics, Vestas in building windmills, they will be ahead of the curve compared to their global competitors and will be able to sell the highest quality products all over the world, including including in Indonesia, and you can be sure that they live up to the highest standards that we have set nationally. Next slide, please. This is just an illustration from the climate program, because we also try to be technology neutral. So it's not that we as a government have said we now will do it this exact way. Every year in the climate program we come up with various scenarios of the emissions reductions impact of whether it's transport or CCS or going into waste or looking at energy, and we look at the cost and the CO2 reduction impact of doing it in different scenarios so that our policymakers can decide on the pathway they want to take. Of course, every year we get a year closer to 2030, and if you don't have the technologies in place, it becomes more and more costly the further you come down the road. But at least this has helped us sort of course correct and give guidance to the policymaking and the price setting. Next slide, please. So to sum up, this is what we do nationally, internationally, and then to finish here, we try then to merge our role as a diplomacy with government-to-government cooperation. We have a strong energy cooperation partnership with Indonesia, but we also then bring in technology, investors, the private sector to help build the investments that support the technology and the diplomacy. And through this kind of operating model, we have been asked to lead in the COP negotiations on mitigation. We did that with the UK in Glasgow, Egypt in Sharm, and last year the global stocktake that set that target that my Chinese colleague talked about on transitioning away from fossil fuels. We facilitated that agreement. And we are asked to do that because of the trust we are building by operating this way. We have also put in place a number of strategic alliances, one to go beyond oil and gas. We have decided to end oil and gas extraction in Denmark. When we did that, we were the largest producer of oil and gas in the European Union, but we are building wind farms instead now where we used to have oil and gas extraction. We are also putting in place a global alliance to build offshore wind. Would love Indonesia to become a member. And we are now also building an alliance to look at how we can scale negative emissions. Our Prime Minister is very active in this space together with the line ministers. And indeed, we are also working with Indonesia in the Just Energy Transition Partnership, trying to combine the energy advisory work with the investments and the private sector engagement. And in that way, we are trying to take what we do nationally and then learn from it and work with partners like Indonesia in the global space to help all of us reach that 1.5 degree target, that trajectory, so that we don't overshoot it too much. And with that, thank you very much, Dino, for giving me the opportunity to speak.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you very much, Thomas. And I think if you listen to Pak Thomas' presentation, remember this, you look at the numbers, right? 70% reduction by 2030. That's very ambitious. So if you talk about climate debate and people say, look, the numbers are not realistic, you listen to that, you remember the presentation that you just heard, the numbers can be achieved. The difference is what? You have to have policies, right? It's not enough just to say, hey, we want net zero. It can only be achieved with bold policies. And the question is, do we have bold policy enough or not? And another point that should be noted is, remember, Denmark's climate targets are legally binding. You know what that means? If the government doesn't commit to meet those climate targets, they are violating the law, melanggar hukum. Ya, kalau di sini kan, oke, kita janji apa, right? Nggak dapat, ya oke, nggak apa-apa, so what, ya kan? Tidak melanggar hukum. Tapi di Denmark, if you make a climate target, climate commitment, that is legally binding. By law, you have to try to achieve it. If not, you are violating the law, right? Yeah, please.
Thank you, Pagdino. Maybe just as an anecdote, when we agreed on the 70% target, that came out of a political process where the Prime Minister was forming her government, and the parties that were going to support her government, they put it as a condition that we would have the 70% target. Our scientists at the time said, we cannot do that. It is unachievable. We know how to get to 60%, 70% is impossible. But the parties that were supporting the Prime Minister said, we don't care. We need, for us to be trustworthy, we need to be on that 70% trajectory. You go and figure out, Prime Minister. If you want to have our support, that's where you need to be. And you need to put it into law, as Pagdino said. So when we started out in 2020, we actually didn't know how to get there. And that's why the independent council that every year in February does the analysis of our policies, the first 3 years they were basically saying, you have no idea what you're doing, you have no plan, you have no policy, you are swimming blind. And my mother was listening more to those people than she was listening to me. But now, in the last report, with those 4 scenarios that we have achieved, we have been working so hard on it with our scientists and our investors that now we actually know how to get to the 70%. And, in fact, our report tells us that we can probably get closer to 80% if we really put our shoulder to the wheel. And at an affordable cost, by the way. That also helps Danish industry to be ahead of the curve. So as a society, we're actually gaining by being more ambitious.
Congratulations. Thank you. I used to think of you as a Viking warrior, Thomas. Now you're a climate warrior. All right. Now there's another country, and actually I have some kind of attachment to this country because I spent 5 years in this country studying and living and working there. And this country has done quite a phenomenal job in terms of climate progress. They reduce emission by 25% since 2010, which is the fastest emission reduction of any G20 countries. They are the first country to phase out coal from their energy, the national energy mix, and they invested $52 billion. Itu berapa triliun tuh? 700 triliun rupiah, and it has created hundreds and thousands of green jobs. Yeah, and also this is a country yang udah made climate emission reduction itu legally binding. So I take great pleasure to invite my good friend Ambassador Dominic Jeremy to tell about the British story. Yeah.
Thank you, Pagdino. Terima kasih. Selamat siang sekalian. Masih tidur? Selamat siang. Terima kasih. Shakespeare's take on climate change. And through this distemperature, we see the seasons alter. The spring, the summer, the autumn, angry winter change and make the mazed world not know which is which. A different take, Sapardi Djoko Damono. Tak ada yang lebih arif dari hujan bulan Juni. Dibiarkannya yang tak terucapkan diserap akar pohon bunga itu. So why do I mention that one? Well, that beautiful poem, Hujan Bulan Juni, is all about somebody whose love is so special, it's so unusual, that it is like having rain in Jakarta in June during the dry season. Okay, so that's one take on climate change. Why do I mention Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream? Well, he was talking about climate change caused by a fight between the king and the queen of the fairies. Well, frankly, ladies and gentlemen, I just wish climate change today had such a simple and innocent cause. In the United Kingdom, we've been thinking about climate change and nature for hundreds of years. In about 60 years after William Shakespeare in the 17th century, a man called John Evelyn, now this guy, he's a scientist. He was one of the founders of our Royal Academy, our Special Science Academy, and he wrote a treatise, wrote a textbook on air pollution caused by burning coal in London. Air pollution caused by burning coal, sound familiar to anybody? And that was 350 years ago. And what he did was, he didn't only set out what the problem was, but he dedicated his book to King Charles II, the ruler, because he recognized that if you want to tackle climate pollution, you need to have political power behind you. And he also came up with some of the solutions. And they include, and I quote, "By reason of the frequent plantations of trees and nurseries for ornament, profit, and security," unquote. Today, we'd call that a nature-based solution to climate change. So fast forward from the 17th century to the 21st century, from King Charles II to King Charles III last year at COP28 in Dubai, and his message to global leaders was, "The hope of the world rests on the decisions you must take." Now, a lot has happened in the 360 years since those two King Charleses. Amongst other things, in the UK, we've experienced an industrial revolution that was originally driven by fossil fuels. And that gave us great wealth and power, but it also had a massively negative impact on our environment, on our nature, and frankly, on our traditional ways of life. And that peaked, that came to its worst point in 1952. And there was something called the Great Smog. And this was air pollution in London that was so bad, 8,000 people died in 1 week. I mean, just imagine that. Next time you're getting fed up with air pollution in Jakarta. 8,000 people died in London in 1 week in 1952 because of air pollution. And so that kicked off for the UK our long and slow and painful transition away from fossil-based fuels. How did we do that? Well, I remember as a kid, in growing up in the UK in the 1970s and 1980s, I remember that there were strikes by coal miners, a bitter dispute in 1984. There were protests in the streets because people felt that the government had forgotten the just part about just energy transition, a critical element. And also there were even power cuts. So this was really hard, but we got through that and we came to a decision that as a country we were going to change our politics. Now, one of our first prime ministers to think about climate change, one of the first global leaders to think about climate change, was actually Margaret Thatcher, who was, for all her many faults, the person I remember associated with those miners' strikes in 1984. In the prime ministership of Gordon Brown, he introduced the legally binding Climate Change Act that Pacdino has just mentioned. Prime Minister Theresa May introduced a legally binding commitment to net zero by 2050. And then Prime Minister Boris Johnson, he hosted COP26. Now, this was the first global summit on climate change since the Rio Earth Summits that really brought nature back into climate negotiations, absolutely critical to solve the whole climate problem. And then the new government of Sir Keir Starmer, our Prime Minister who came in last month, that has committed to the UK to zero carbon electricity by 2030. So we're making decarbonising our economy an absolute driver for how we think politically. And we've been at the forefront of climate and nature science as the UK since the 19th century. You remember Charles Darwin? Charles Darwin? Good. He was one of the first thinkers about nature. He transformed our ideas about nature, and he did that by observing Galapagos finches. But while he was doing that, at the same time here in Indonesia, Alfred Russel Wallace was looking at endemic Indonesian species across your archipelago. And so the science that we have today has moved on since then, but we stand, ladies and gentlemen, on the shoulders of giants. But it's not just scientists you need. You've got to get the politics right, you've got to get the science right, but you also need economists involved in decarbonizing your economy. And there are two outstanding British economists I want to mention. One is Lord Stern, and the other is Partha Dasgupta. And they produced two reports on the economics of biodiversity and the economics of climate change. And these two reports brought business into the whole climate and nature conversation almost for the first time. And that enables us to bring private capital and private sector solutions into tackling climate change. They also put a value on the natural world, and that is essential because now we can actually understand the cost of nature and climate that we've been exploiting as though they are a free good. So with the science right, with the politics right, the policies should follow. And the policies need to be based on evidence, data, and science. In the UK, our science-based policies mean our emissions have nearly halved. In fact, they are already half of our baseline in 1990, and they are on the way down. So get this, last year in 2023, our emissions were lower than they were at the very height of the pandemic in 2020, when our economy had been shut down for 6 months of the year. And indeed, we've kept on course despite the massive impact to European fuel supply caused by Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine. And in fact, as a result of that, Europe has managed to end its addiction to fossil fuels from Russia. So how are we doing this in the UK? Number one, by leaving coal behind and embracing renewable energy. In practice, for us, decarbonisation means hundreds of thousands of green jobs, as Pat Dino mentioned earlier. It means a much better air quality in the UK. And part of that is this year, we are closing our final coal-fired power station. No more coal-fired power stations in the United Kingdom after this year. And it also means economic growth, which is critical for governments to deliver to their people. And in the UK, our economy has grown by 80% since our 1990 baseline. So number two, we're doing this because we have a system for action that doesn't allow politicians to meddle with it. And that is critical. So we have a committee, an independent committee of scientists and experts. It's called the Climate Change Committee, and they set carbon budgets for the whole economy. And that committee and their advice and this way of approaching carbon budgets has survived 5 general elections in the UK, and it survived 7 prime ministers. And number three, we are embracing nature. And nature provides some of the cheapest and the best ways of tackling climate change, as John Evelyn understood way back in the 17th century. In Indonesia, you do this with mangrove replanting, you preserve your forest, you replant forests. You have some sustainable approaches to agriculture, like Bali's Subak system. Well, in the UK, we've committed to a 30 by 30 rule, protecting 30% of our land and 30% of our ocean by 2030, and restoring those natural ecosystems. So you get the policies right, the politics right, the science right, and then you've got to get people to care. And so finally, I'd like to close by mentioning an outstanding nature and climate change communicator, Jane Goodall and David Attenborough. Have you heard of either of those? Excellent. Well, when I was a kid, they were the people who made me care about nature, about biodiversity, about climate change. And now people in the UK, they vote for climate action because of some outstanding communicators who've really made us care. So before I finish, you might wonder what the map is with all these pins on. These are projects, programs that the UK and Indonesia are doing that are about biodiversity restoration, they're about tackling climate change, they're about sustainable infrastructure, and they are about renewable energy. And those are ones that we're doing together in your country. So if there is one message I would like all of you to take from my talk today, it is that people in the UK really care about restoring biodiversity and about taking action on climate change, and that we want to do that in partnership with you. So please take action, whatever you do. I would love it if you came to my country, to the UK, to study in this space. There are Chevening scholarships from the UK government, LPDP scholarships as well, many of them to the United Kingdom. I would love you to get in touch with me and my embassy to see what we're doing, because the basic message is none of us can tackle climate change alone. Tetapi bersama kita bisa. So if Pak Dina will allow me, I'm just going to close, and you've got to say cakap for my pantun, okay? Pergi ke mall beli sepatu. Beli dua gratis satu. Net zero FPCI di hari Sabtu. Emang boleh sekeren itu. Terima kasih.
Thank you, Dominic. That was very inspiring. And by the way, I'm sorry, I was rooting for England at the Euro Cup. So next time, yeah. So, but
Inshallah.
Please have a seat. Yeah, have a seat. I would like to invite Pa Liu Chen Min and then Thomas Anker on the stage. And I want to invite the students to start going up to ask questions. Yeah, please. We'll get there. Just line up behind the microphone, yeah? Yeah, okay. Good.
We're here.
Please. Pak Dominic bisa di sini.
Di sini? Okay.
But, before we turn the questions to the audience, I want to ask an important question about the political will. Right? I was listening to your presentation. There was consistency, obviously, in the political will towards climate policies. And in China also, there's strong political will, and also in the UK. But any of you want to comment on how did that political will come about? Because I think in any country, without that political will, then climate policy becomes wishy-washy, right? And as I said earlier, in many countries around the world, once you change political leaders, then the climate policy becomes undone in some occasions, yeah. So anyone want to comment on this political will issue? Yeah.
I can kick off. In my country, we had an election in 2019 that sort of changed the political landscape, and that election, much to the surprise of the politicians, became a climate election driven by students but also by their grandparents, and not one particular political party. It was across the whole political spectrum from the left to the right. So the story I told about the Prime Minister being needing to agree to a 70% target, even though the policymakers, her officials said that it couldn't be done, was very much driven by popular will, by popular demand, but also because the private sector was telling the government, we need you to be more ambitious. So in a way, you had a marriage of students and their grandparents with the private sector that was pushing the government to be more ambitious. And that public political will articulated by the population and the business has basically stayed ever since. And now it's become, as you say, Pak, it's become sort of a stable of Danish politics, and it is a broad political agreement from the far left to the far right, and the law, when it was adopted with a 95% of the votes in parliament, and I mean, it stands until 2030, and we're going to update it next year when we, at the European level, will adopt our new NDC that will go until 2035. The proposal on the table is for a 90% reduction in 2040, which we nationally strongly support. And when that is adopted at EU level, we will then have to reflect that in our own law and update our law. And there's no question about that. We hope that EU will be more ambitious than the 90%, but who knows? I mean, that's...
Thank you. China?
Thank you. I think it'd be, from my experience, since we the humans started to the global process for addressing climate change, my assessment would be both for domestic and for international policy, we need both stable and strong leadership. Like I think it'd be, for China, I think it'd be why we have been so effective over the past years in responding to climate change. I think also we have a very strong leadership, very firm leadership. I think, of course, the leadership also listens to the people. Internationally, I think, of course, we're also expecting to have a strong global leadership. That means be United Nations, UNFCCC framework, that we could get stronger to coordinate the global action. You know that over the past 30 years since the entry into force of the Convention of Equality, in some parties, because the instability of leadership, because change of leadership, sometimes some administration, they have been strong in supporting the climate cooperation, global climate cooperation, and for some administration, they withdrew from the global process. That's really damaged the global cooperation. I think that's where we're expecting to be each country, every country, that their leadership, whatever party, they really should listen to the people, that be not just decide their climate policy individually, they should listen to the people. Listen to other countries. Internationally, I think we need to really continue to improve the trust between the North and the South, really to build up the multilateralism. Thank you.
Thank you. Dominic, I have a question for you. Europe now is in war. At least there's a war in Europe. Sorry, I need to. There's a war in Europe, and geopolitical tension is very high. I think some 20 NATO countries have upped their defense budget to 2% of their GDP, and more will follow suit. Are you not worried that more resources will go towards military purpose than they would go for climate actions? Yeah.
So we have to be very careful to make sure that the investment that we make reflects the long-term priorities, not just the priorities of this year and next year. And I think that there is, so I mentioned that Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine had in fact caused the European Union to cut its dependency on Russia's fossil fuels. And what that is an example of is the acceleration of the move towards green energy. Because if you use green energy, if you generate it yourself, you are not dependent on pipelines. You have much better energy security. And so I think that there is a way of thinking about geopolitical tensions that can actually help drive the switch to a green economy. But I mean, it's clearly a concern if people are directing resources away from green energy transition. And the way I look at how we approach this, to your earlier question, this in the UK, first of all, we make sure that what we do is based on science and data, as I mentioned in my presentation. It isn't based on party politics. So there is consensus, whether you are from the left or the right, whatever party. This is science and data, and we're going to stick with that. It's also something that people care passionately about, and that's what they vote for. And so I think, regardless of the geopolitical tensions, regardless of other things going on, even regardless of England not winning the Euro Football Cup, people are going to be passionately holding the UK government to account, bureaucrats like me to account, for delivering on climate change. And I was at COP26, not as an official. I was there with an NGO, and I was lobbying the government. I was out there in the streets, shouting and chanting. And goodness me, there were hundreds of thousands of people there because they care, and they're determined not to make the same mistakes that my generation made in the past.
Thank you. So we're going to take some questions from the audience. This time's up, but we still got time, right? 7 minutes. Okay, all right. So I'm going to take at first 2-2, and the rule is very simple. Not one ABC questions, just one question. Introduce yourself and go straight to your questions. I'll take the first two on the left and the first two on the right. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you for the opportunities. Thank you for all of the ambassador and the panelists. My name is Wawdiandi Siti Azida Hajaria. My institution is Universitas Indonesia Maju. I'm a lecturer. I'm so sorry, I have to read this. My campus tried to convert from plastic bottle to tumbler water bottle for every student. And the United Kingdom is the home to a growing movement of green campuses where universities are actively working to reduce their carbon footprint and environmental impact. So can you explain to us or motivate us to be consistent, or we can commit to be a greener future? Because I have my own research to University of Edinburgh, and my university, the next year I will depart from Indonesia to Nottingham, University of Nottingham. Thank you. Really great for they is lead for the waste disposals. They are the leader for reduce or recycling systems. So can you motivate us, or you just explain to us about it?
Thank you. Gentleman on the right, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Widi, Pak, and I have a question. Basically, I prepared 3 for each of them, but I will pick one. I have a dream to develop wind energy in Indonesia. That dream came from Sir David Attenborough, and I'm highly influenced by him. My question is, he in several moments said that we should reconsider the economic growth not only based on the GDP, and not using the GDP growth as a sole measure to the economy and prosperity. This is also, I believe it's referred to Karen Raworth's donut economy model. And what is your view, Pak, to what kind of measure we can put in ESG measures and anything like that to measure our economic growth? Thank you very much.
Okay, gentlemen.
Okay, thank you, Pak Dino. Good afternoon to distinguished and honorable ambassador. My question is directed to His Excellency Yu Zhenmin, the Special Envoy for China. As we all know that China is one of the biggest producers and exporters of electric vehicle, especially in Indonesia. So I just curious, and my question to you, is there any diplomatic effort or maybe cooperation between China and Indonesia to address climate change? Or maybe is there any way possible to create a new diplomatic efforts to address this issue? Thank you.
Okay, the lady.
All right, thank you very much. My name is Tiar, and I have a question for anyone who wants to answer, ambassadors. So foreign policy starts at home, and that's how grassroots are able to voice their concerns and let policymakers do it, and whether it's domestically or internationally. Mr. Jeremy also mentioned that we need communicators in this issue, right? But these voices are sometimes raised often by CSOs. I'm sure that you are familiar with Extinction Rebellion and any other CSOs. However, there will always be one case each year, at least in Indonesia or any other parts of the world, that climate activists are being criminalized for voicing out their concerns. And therefore, have this happened in any part of your country, and how would you view this certain challenge? Thank you.
Okay. The lady, yeah, that's a good question. Thank you, thank you. Lady, by the way, the ambassadors, you're free to answer or not answer any part of the questions, yeah? But I'm just going to take as many questions as I can just to get the feel of the audience. Please.
Thank you very much for giving me the chance, and I thank you all for the enlightening presentations and also for the moderator. I would like to address the questions to all the speakers. So, which should take precedence? Achieving NDCs or ensuring a just transition, and how can they be effectively integrated? So I think if it is possible for all the speakers to share their thoughts in regard to this question, and I guess that covers my curiosity. Thank you very much for the chance.
Okay, the lady in orange, yes.
All right, hello, my name is Dwi, teacher from one private school from Bogor, who actually has a big concern on zero emission. I just read from the worldpopulation.com that China has 1,142 coal plants, and since 2023, still down into 360 coal plants. So my question is, Mr. Liu, does China reconcile its rapid expansion to the coal power plants and continue to reliance on fossil fuels with its commitment, and how to lead in clean energy development on carbon neutrality? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the questions. Now, for the ambassadors, the rule is you all have 2 minutes each because Ray is looking at me to make sure that the next session is on time. I'll give Dominic first. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Fabulous questions. Thank you all. Really brilliant. Yeah, give yourself a round of applause. You've just eaten 10 of my seconds. So the lady who's going off to Nottingham, congratulations to you. You've talked about something near to my heart that I care passionately about, which is getting plastic out of rivers. Please, all of you, look up the One Less campaign. So Google One Less campaign. When you get home, not now, listen to me now. And you'll find out about a program of people engagement that we did in the UK. ZSL, my NGO, led this. And it was about getting people to stop using single-use plastic bottles because we were finding they were going into the Thames. And this led to a transformation where businesses were stopping to have these in their supply chains. The government stopped using single-use plastic bottles, and people felt that it was really wrong to use them, and so they recycled bottles, and they used the mayor of London put out lots of water refilling points so people could get free water from the street. So community engagement for that was absolutely essential to change people's behaviors. And climate change action is all about changing people's behaviors. So you talked about economic growth and other ways of thinking about it than GDP. A really, really great question, because GDP is such a narrow way of thinking about human well-being. And nature-based accounting and some of the work that Partha Dasgupta did on the economics of biodiversity, take a look at that report, because that shows a different way of thinking about how countries and how companies can do their accounts that values things that we really care about, like nature and like climate change. I would just mention that just transition and green transition, you are absolutely right. They've got to go hand in hand. They've got to be completely integrated, because you have to bring people with you. And that's why the transition to the green economy, if you can make that about the creation of jobs, if you can make that about innovation, if you can make that about people's lives becoming better because they've moved away from, I don't know, dangerous jobs mining coal to something that enables them to have a dignified existence and income that lets their children go to school and do so safe in the knowledge that their parents are going to survive the day in a less dangerous environment, then you've created something that is well worth having for your society. And the hundreds of thousands of green transition jobs that we've seen in the United Kingdom do exactly that.
Thank you. Thomas, 2 minutes.
Thank you for all the students' extremely good questions, and I would say keep up that engagement, and I hope that you are making those comments everywhere you go, and using that also to be active in your own community and for pushing this agenda, because we need your voice locally but also globally. And there was the question about whether we have criminalized climate activists. Not to my knowledge. In my country, we try to include everyone in the democratic dialogue, and people who have a different opinion, we invite them inside for a cup of coffee, and we talk to them, and we try to understand where they come from, and then if there are enough people who have that opinion, we also try to adjust our position and our policies. We hosted a climate ministerial a few years ago where there were climate demonstrators tying themselves to the lampposts and gluing themselves to the street outside. We had foreign ministers in the building, and then actually some of the ministers from the global south, including from the Arab world, who maybe were not used to engaging with these types of activists, they actually went out into the street and invited our activists inside for a conversation about climate change and climate action, and that became a really positive dialogue. So I would hope that you could also try to go down that pathway here. There was a question about how to measure GDP. That is a really complicated question that economists haven't reached the end of, as you know. But one thing that I think you should do, and that we are doing, is putting a price on externalities. That is the most rational way to reduce your emissions is by putting a price on carbon, and in that sense putting a price on the polluter. And measuring that, and as I said in my presentation, we have now introduced a price on emissions from livestock and agriculture, maybe as the first country, which was politically really complicated, but we had a dialogue with also the farmers' unions and the agricultural industry, and everybody realized that if the nature part of our economy didn't contribute, we can never get to net zero. It's about 30% of our economy, and if they don't play a part, it's simply not doable. And actually, it is 30% of the global economy as well. So we have to work together globally on how to bring down emissions and count nature into the climate equation. Right now, everything is focused on the transition away from fossil fuels that my Chinese colleague mentioned, but the nature-based solutions have to be tackled as well. And then finally, the just transition. I couldn't agree more with Dominic. And of course, it is in many countries presented as a dilemma that you cannot achieve economic growth without it being fossil-based. But the situation is also this, that if we don't collectively stay roughly in the 1.5 degree space, if temperatures really grow up, you will see ocean rising much faster, violent storms and hurricanes becoming more frequent. I spoke to my Indonesian colleague the other day, and she said that last year in Indonesia, you had more than 5,400 climate-related weather incidents, and that is going up. I mean, that is dramatic. And we know that the ocean rise is going faster around the equator in your shores than in our part of the world, but I think there's a new report due out on Tuesday from the UN that will show that ocean rise is going much faster than expected. This UN Secretary General will present it at a Pacific Summit in Tonga. And in that sense, the two have to be combined, working on bringing down emissions and the just transition and the job creation. That's also why we are engaged in Indonesia in supporting your just energy transition, in working with the government, the industry, to try to see how we can support the transition away from coal and into renewable energy. And hopefully we can work together on accelerating that transition in the years to come.
Thank you. Liu, your 2 minutes here.
Thank you for the colleagues for the 6 good questions. I think it'd be, let me follow up some of the observations by Dominic and Thomas. First, I think definitely I fully agree. For all countries, for the world, we must go beyond GDP for measurement. I think when I was Under-Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs in the UN, we also discussed in the United Nations how to help member states to go beyond the measurement of the GDP. But we cannot avoid measurement of GDP, that's the basis. I think China's experience will be over the past year that we have combination of 4 area policies, like we call it reducing, controlling pollution, reducing emissions, expanding green coverage, and advancing growth. That be if any government could combine these 4 areas of a policy, of the integrated policy, you are going to achieve a lot. So that's, I think, this is one of the experience. So with Indonesia, I think since China, Indonesia, both developing countries, Asian developing countries, I think it'd be some of the Chinese experience would be good for Indonesia. For example, I think after 7 years for me, after coming back for Jakarta, I found that the air pollution in Jakarta was at the same as 7 years ago. I don't know, getting better or getting worse, but there's no big change. How to improve that? I think it's good for Indonesian government, for the municipal government, to use this opportunity of any transition, that it be you use more green the electric cars. You encourage people to use more electric motorcycles, especially impose the taxi drivers mandatorily to use the electric cars. I think from Chinese experience, immediately after a few months after a year, the air quality will change. That would be good for the cities, I think, cities. So please combine the controlling of pollution with reducing the emissions together in the cities. You are going to achieve that result, good result. But this should have the support of the people, including young people. I think you will not be so exciting to riding the electric motorcycle, but for the sake of the better air quality for the city, I think you are going to achieve a lot. So we need that be mobilize people support. Second, I think the third issue that I want to really to assure you that China, Indonesia has great potential to collaborate in the coming decade and the coming decades. But we are close neighbors, we have the similar situation for energy transition. I think we can collaborate in expanding our renewable energy capacity, spending our cooperation in the manufacturing of many of the renewable energy products. So I think I'm confident that as long as we started cooperation, there's already some good project cooperation. I think China can really share with Indonesia a lot and help Indonesia start a real energy transition process. Fourth, I want to say that I admire Indonesia's government's decision for this net zero target around 2050, but also advised and suggested Indonesia really want to start a process, what your national plan for achieving this net zero targets. I think that for China's experience, we take 2 steps as a developing country. So our situation different from European friends. That they already achieved carbon peaking many years ago, even for European Union members, including UK, the former European Union member, they already achieved carbon peaking in the 1990s. For China, we are going to achieve carbon peaking before 2030. I think as a developing country, this 2-step approach might be more important. But to convince government, convince our enterprises that we have to achieve carbon peaking first. Then we should start our process of carbon neutrality. Then I think since China started this process since a decade ago, that we are reducing our coal consumption and coal production dramatically. That's why, as I mentioned in my remarks, traditionally we have a high percentage of coal share in our energy consumption, over 80%. Now we reduced to 56%. I think gradually we should reduce our coal component in our energy to a very small percentage. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's give a big hand to all the panelists. It's been a fascinating discussion. I'm sorry to all the audience who wanted to ask questions, but we have limited time and we have to move on to the next discussions. I want to close with a pantun in the tradition of Pak Dominic.
Terima kasih.
Siap dengan cakapnya? All right. Pak Liu, Pak Dominic, Pak Thomas.
Cakap.
Mari bersama-sama menuju Indonesia Emas. And by the way, this is very important for Pak Dominic. He has to report to his government the public feeling about the UK's football. I just want to get hands up showing how many of you, and raise your hand if you think so, how many of you, Cindy, are you recording? Can you get a video of this? The audience, yeah? How many of you believe by 2045, the UK will win either the World Cup or Euro Cup?
How many by 2025?
Okay, so I think we get the answer. So you will report that to the government. Yes, okay. Thank you very much, everybody. Yeah.
I don't think there's a major tournament.
Okay, wonderful.